Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and welcome to a new VFX breakdown. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the Terminator Dark Fate VFX breakdown. In part 1 of the series, we're going to be discussing two particular scenes. The first sequence is the arrival with the time travel portals and discussing the visual effects involved in that. The second one is actually the flashback to the future, and we're going to discuss a lot of the visual effects involved there as well. In part 2, which will be coming out shortly, we're going to be breaking down the big end sequence as well as the airplane fight and a lot of the other big visual effects in the film. So really quick, I just want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and if you want to help support the channel and make sure that I can do future videos like this one, then take a moment to check out the link below this video. You're going to get 2 months free access to their premium level membership, which means all of their classes, all their training, all their knowledge is going to help get you to the next level in your career, as well as level up your skills. So I love all the classes on how to operate different cameras, as well as filmmaking in general, as well as all the creative tools, whether I'm learning Photoshop, After Effects, Max, Maya, Houdini, whatever it might be. They've got classes on everything that you can instantly access right now. So the best part is this means that you can log in, check out the things that you need a quick answer on, or if you want to get fully immersed and learn from the beginning to the end, everything on that topic you can. So there's so much you can learn on that platform, and it's definitely the Swiss Army knife of learning that you should definitely have access to. So check out the link below this video to get 2 months premium level access to their membership platform and every single class they have on it right now. So if you like these videos, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and at the same time, if you have any questions or there's a particular movie that you would like to see covered in a future video, then make sure to leave a comment below and I'll make sure to respond to that as well. Finally, if there's any tutorials or any specific effect that you saw that you're like, wow, I would love to see how they did that, like an actual step-by-step tutorial, let me know in the comments as well. And I'll do my best to create an additional tutorial specifically on how to create that effect. So leave a comment below and let me know. Finally, speaking of tutorials, I just released a 10 video series on creating realistic dynamic destruction of buildings in a live action environment. So I actually went out and shot in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, right near the beach, one of the iconic buildings there. And then we reconstructed the building and did all the camera tracking, as well as then setting it all up to be ready for destruction. All the dynamics, everything set up and ready to work. So if you want to check out this free training, you can go to liveactionvfx.com and you'll be able to download all 10 videos, as well as the scene files, the footage, the rotor mats, as well as the HDRI, the scans, everything else that you need to recreate the actual shot shown in the video. You can also just check out the link in the description as well. Okay, so that being said, let's talk Terminator Dark Fate. Okay, let's dive right into this. So these shots here are more establishing that something's happening, right? So it's freezing everything and it builds up to the electricity, and then eventually we get the portal happening, which is in the middle of the road. So I want to break down shot by shot what's going on. So just initially looking at this shot here, what I like about this is that when you're initially figuring out these shots, a lot of these close-up shots, you could probably just go entirely CG if you wanted to. In some ways, it would make it easier because it's such a macro close-up shot of the ground where everything's reflective. It's probably easier just to kind of go that route. However, it's actually what you get in camera that really makes the shot. So in this case, there's crystallization going on, and it's got to match all the bokeh and all the spec, everything else going on. And this is an anamorphic lens, so in a way it's a bit more trickier to match this up, but at the same time the payoff is that you get a lot of really great lighting reference for how everything should react, as well as what the lens itself is doing in the shot. But on top of that, you get a lot of stuff that would be a lot harder to pull off in 3D for free. So choosing to go live action, shooting it all practical, then adding to it is an interesting choice, and it makes it 10 times more beautiful than what you probably end up with just going entirely CG. What I like is that you got everything is pretty out of focus here anyway, just because it is so tight on everything that it's completely macro. There's nothing really in focus, but you got all this kind of crystallized ice forming everywhere and all the mist everywhere as well. So there's just a fluid sim and a particle sim here, which has this growing kind of crystal effect. You see it a lot more prominent in the second shot. So focusing on the second shot, this is further away. So before, if you were looking at this, the camera's kind of like just really low on the ground, like a lipstick camera almost, shooting that shot. But here we got still quite macro, not macro, but quite tight in on everything. I love all the crystal, everything forming here. So the way you would do this, I believe, like I've actually put out a tutorial on YouTube, which is on how to create fire, where we would actually paint the growth where we want it to be and then activate that. And I think it's kind of very similar, where you're kind of choosing very organically where you want all of the ice crystals to form, rather than being just like, okay, activate this area here and here and here. You're going in and specifically saying, I want it to be growing along here, and creeping along and kind of building up the growth. So I'd assume that there's more of an intelligent system built around this that gives you more of an organic feel to it. Like I said, this is all anamorphic, so the tricky thing about doing anamorphic lenses is not that big a deal, but it definitely complicates the tracking a little bit. It makes it a bit more difficult than, you know, just doing a typical prime or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, again, these shots are really beautiful. It's just all it is you're building a growth system, which, you know, doing something like this, if you're ever interested, I'd be happy to put together a tutorial specifically around how to do something like this. But you would initially have like a map or something. You could, you know, paint, if you want, on the surface wherever you want this stuff to go, and then you would have activators or an activating algorithm that grows kind of like an L tree system and spreads out over everything. But the main thing is that as something crystallizes, you would have a mask around that area. Okay, so the mask is kind of more of like a frosted area, so that way it doesn't just feel like these things are appearing out of nowhere. Typically, everything, depending on the angle, you can see it more down here. There's like a kind of a frosted, displaced texture over everything, and then from there, there's all these crystals kind of being formed on top of it all. So that sort of stuff, you would initially have some points that you're working from, and those would start to grow out crystals into different shapes, and they'd all grow randomly, things like that. So again, you could build this up in a way that it's pretty straightforward to do, but everything usually is meshed as one overall system, whether it's Bridson or a different algorithm, but something that can give you a lot of detail. So you get all these imperfections through displacement, but also lots of just particles growing out these systems on top. So it's not very difficult to do. And like I said, I'd be happy to do like a tutorial on something like this. Just leave a comment and let me know if that's something you want to see, because I think this sort of stuff's really fun. But I love the look of it. I love the integration with the live action plate. And like I said, by having a live action plate rather than just going entirely CG, I feel like there's a lot of imperfections that you get that really make it up. So I think that works really well. And then of course, having that particle system emit fluids on top of that, so that way you get this kind of cold, misty ice mist growing up on top of everything as well. So pretty cool. So jumping ahead a little bit, I really like these shots here. And I'm just going shot by shot right now, but I like the stuff. Again, it's just like the chaoticness of it, the randomness. Doing something like this, again, I've put out a few tutorials on how to create lightning, but it's not too difficult to pull something like this off. But the main thing is that you're driving all of this procedurally. So you can have a contact point that, or a couple that a lot of this is coming out from, and it's more like the way that this works is you'll have an initial random contact points. These just randomly generate typically, and then that will create a fork effect that you kind of choose the direction of at a certain. Again, this is typically how I would do it, at least. At a certain point, it's going to spawn just like randomly along the length of it. It's going to spawn more of these that are attracted to the ground. So they kind of like search for a landing point and split off from there, and you can have some of these additional forks going on. So in the past, like if you go back 10 years doing this sort of stuff, like even more recently, I'm trying to think of what I saw recently. There's a couple of films that even, I think Thor and a few other ones I saw on the plane the other day, not that long ago. If you go back to them, they look terrible. Like they look really, really bad. And the reason is because usually what you would do is you would have, let me choose a better color for this. You would typically have a origin point, and it would just be a spline. So the spline would randomly wave around like this direction, that direction. So what you get is kind of like a random noise spline like that with, a lot of octaves, so it would be a lot sharper. But that's typically what your lightning is going to look like. And then you would run it in comp through a tool which would generate a lot of forks. So these would just be 2D generated forks on top of it. And so most of the lightning that you would see out there always looked really bad because it was always just the same thing. It was just basically a long spline randomized and then having kind of like forks being generated on top. But there's nothing intelligent about it, and it isn't that random when it really comes down to it. So XSI had a plugin that did a really good job on that. So that was one thing that even if you're doing stuff in Houdini or Maya or Max, you would typically export the stuff into XSI just to run the lightning, just because there was some good results you could get. Weta was the first studio I ever saw to do really good lightning, and that was for Nikola Tesla's machine he built in the Prestige. And that's where they actually built like a really intelligent system that would interact. It would do all the behavior that you would see in lightning. So these days, there's a lot of really cool systems that do a lot of this intelligently, and you can do some really great results with it. So it's still spline-based to an extent, but by having it all particle-driven, it means you can have it create a lot of intelligent behavior around it. So the main thing is having these origin points. These are then saying randomly on a set length to fork out again. So they're spawning another, and they're looking for contact points. And so that's how you get something like that. And then a couple of random forks or whatever. So you could do some of this quite easily. The main thing is that you also got a mask of mist, which is that icy displacement kind of shader that's growing over everything. And that's also then that shader is spawning this icy mist over everything. And I'd imagine this is a gradient, so that way the center point is most focused and it's more falling off to the edges. So that way it's only the widest points that will emit fluid, or at least emit more intensely. And then also on top of that, drive everything else. So that's at least how I would approach something like this, but I think that the execution works. You can see the icy shader, it's spreading over everything. As it's spreading, it's also creating that mist, and then you get the lightning here. I like the fact that there are random sparks as well, which is a nice touch. I'd say that's more of a supervisor note, like, hey, you know what, it'd be cool, let's add in some sparks as well. So the cool thing, the smart thing I'll say about that is that by adding a couple of random sparks, it really helps with the contrast, because everything in here are cool colors. They're all blue hues. So at least having some kind of orange, which if you look at the color wheel, is the opposite side of blue. By having some of these warmer colors, it just helps break it up and just make things a little bit more interesting. So the other thing I like is that the car is moving by. Every time they whip by, you'll see that they actually affect the mist. It's subtle, but little things like that really go a long way to help just kind of get everything to sit in the same environment. So same deal here. This is really cool. So you can see the shape represents exactly where the sphere is going to sit in. So you can see it's actually created this kind of crest build up around it. So I think that's really cool. I kind of wonder, there's subtleties like that I just imagine it's more the concept artist or the production designer who's come along and done some really cool paintings. I was just watching Blade Runner 2049, and there's so many shots that you could just tell the composition. It was just like, that's frame for frame what someone's painted up. It's just so perfect. And it's subtleties like this that, if you're just to say, okay, we want a radial build out here and it's going to create the sphere, yeah, it's usually just a lot of these things that have been thought to death that are just such a nice touch. So I really like the build up kind of representing the outskirts of where the sphere is about to kick in. So that's really cool. And you can see all the shader. So again, displacement or particles everywhere growing out. At this point, it's grown quite widely. So you can see it's actually going all the way across the road. Whereas a majority of the mist and everything else is more around the focal point here. Then it also helps kind of refocus the eye. The eye has always got to be focused here. So that's the hottest point, in other words, the brightest. Whereas a lot of this is kind of out of the lighting. But you can see it's continued to grow, but this is the big focal area. So again, I like the lightning here. You can see how as it's interacting and hitting the metal, it's creating off-screen a lot of sparks as well, which is really cool. Good old lens flare as it flashes out and then comes back in. Again, I'm going to get into a bit of how to go about creating this sort of effect in a minute, but I'm trying to remember the approach. I think they wanted more of like an underwater kind of bubbling kind of effect, and that was what this portal is meant to represent. So I'd imagine it's a lot of volumetrics layered together to kind of create this sort of thing. I've done very similar effects in the past. A couple of subtleties here I really like is the fact that it is wedged in the ground, you know, because again, it's kind of a Boolean. It's taking over world space. So whatever's there before, it's replacing. So you can see the structural integrity of the ground is all breaking and cracking because suddenly there's this hole kind of just carved into the ground. You can also see on this frame, to help kind of sell the effect, just like you're seeing lightning before hitting the metal bars, creating little sparks everywhere. You can see over here that the lightning is actually hitting the car and the car is veering off over here. All of these things are so subtle, but they help tie the entire effect into the shot and make it feel like it's actually there rather than being a visual effect. So I'm going to play these two shots back to back. And again, I think that this sequence in general, I feel, is so underrated in terms of me looking at this. I love this. This is why I wanted to talk about it. But for a lot of people, it's more of a throwaway. You're probably not going to remember this too much, but I just think this is just well put together. It's very quick cuts, but it tells a lot. So again, you've got this chaotic thing that appears in the middle of the road. The electricity, you know, works really well. The blue, and then of course all the street lights being more tungsten, work really well. What I think is really cool is you can see there's a lot of invisible effects that you kind of don't see at first, but the ground being all cracked apart, lightning hitting the car, creating that contact point, even though it's for 2 frames. It's just stuff like that. Again, like a lot of these things get lost in the handles. So for anyone not working in film, usually what you'll have, I'll try and explain this the best I can, you'll have a shot, let's say that this is the edit, and so this is your film clip, and let's say that's 170 frames. Perhaps you're going to have 12 frame handles, and that means that on the head and tails, in other words, the start and end, you're going to have 12 frame handles. So in other words, you would have this be 194 frames total because it's got the additional 24 frames, 12 on each end. I've worked on some projects that were 24 frame handles, which on a 17 frame shot, which is just ridiculous. But the whole point of this is so that way you can slip the edit. If you're like, hey, you know what? I'd love to see those sparks for a couple more frames hitting with the lightning going along it. You can slip the entire edit by 10 frames and you get those extra 10 frames. So rather than saying, hey, we got to go back and get more frames created, which actually is so much more work to go back and add those extra frames in than it was just to have them all there in the first place. It's a lot smarter to have the head and tails here, the handles, so that way you can slip it and edit if you need to. And I feel like some of this stuff, you know, it's probably one of those things that the artist working on the shot probably put in all these subtleties, like the lightning hitting the car, and you don't get to appreciate it because it's 2 frames. It's literally 2 frames, and then it's off out of the edit. And so I think that there's a lot of subtleties that went into the shot that totally get missed. I'm pretty confident that these are all CG cars at this point. I'm wondering how much of this actually is CG, now that I'm looking a bit closer. I think it's all fine, and it's just around here it maybe goes for more of a CG approach. I'm kind of curious. I'm definitely gonna have to reach out to these guys and check at this point. But yeah, I'd say all the cars are CG as soon as they start getting haywire. So looking at the remainder of the shot, again, lightning flashing everywhere. It's very staccato. So at this point, it's kind of at full force. You've got all the things that are working in the shot. Everything's broken apart. Everything's frozen. There's mist everywhere. The lightning and the orb here are illuminating everything as well. On top of that, you've got all these cars, you know, spinning out of control. But what I really like is that you have CG car here that actually gets frozen on the edges. You can see also because it's metal, the lightning is hitting it, creating sparks. All of these things are just such subtle things that you don't really get a chance to appreciate. The foreground, ice growing everywhere. You can see it's out of focus, like kind of dripping down the edges. There's a lot of work that has gone into these shots that it's such a quick shot, you don't really get to appreciate it. And that's why I wanted to break it down a little bit, is just because it looks great. The attention to detail that's gone into this is really amazing. So this is a continuation of the same shot. So this is actually panning down under the bridge now. I'm kind of wondering in this case whether this was just a completely CG decision under the bridge, just to go all CG. I could be wrong about that. I just feel like unless you got the perfect scenario where all of that is exactly what you want it to be, I would just kind of pan down from here and then, you know, at this point go entirely CG, so that way you can dress the set exactly how you want and get the look that you want as well, and not have to worry about continuity as well as the lighting and everything else. But again, there's a lot of subtleties, stuff falling down, you know, just in general, really cool continuation. I feel like a lot of this is volumetrics for this. I was actually going to speak to one of my buddies. He's the CG soup on this, over at ILM at least, just to kind of confirm a lot of this, but at least that's the take that I would go with this. But in terms of the effect, at least how I would do this would be basically because I've done this so many times, so not to say that this is how it was done, but I would have my Da Vinci circle, perfect circle here. I would have a spherical of kind of volumetrics, but I would have like a 3D noise moving through it. So the 3D noise creates pockets of negative space, but this is something that you could layer in lots of this stuff. The whole point is that you get these pockets of really interesting shapes that are fluid driven, but initially come from patterns, and they're all swirling around, and that could be a kind of outer layer, which is very hot. So inside of there, though, you would have a lower density volumetric sphere kind of filling out that negative space, and then you could have another one which is more detailed patterns moving around it as well. And part of that is that the first one is also going outside of that sphere. It's not like inside of it exclusively. So you end up with this lower density 3D sphere filling out the volume, but then you've got all these other patterns kind of moving and shifting around over the top. And then you can build in more shaded detail from there. But at least for me, that's how I've done it every single time. It's just creating really interesting layers of volumetrics that all sit together inside of a volumetric apparatus. And that's how you pull off an effect like that. It looks really cool. I like it. And so again, not to say that that's how it was done, but I imagine that's how it probably would be done. So hopefully you're not offended by butts, especially CG ones. But just to chat about the shot for a quick second. So again, you know, all you're doing is rendering this out and then taking that out in the next part. I'd imagine that this is just something that you've got the layer in comp and you turn it off so it fades out in comp. I love all the hot edges and everything. The broken, like I'd imagine a lot of this is matte painting to get all that surface detail, everything else. Again, I really think that this previous shot is CG. Not because it looks CG or anything like that. It's just, that's the call that I would have made. That's all basically a matte painting. By matte painting, I just mean that it's painted detail rather than just straight up texture, so that we can get a bit more specific about everything. So whether it's in Mari or however you want to do it. So this is a digi-double here, so forget the actress's name, but you've just got her as kind of a ragdoll. Not a ragdoll, but it's animated to be basically one. So that way you get that reaction. And usually having a beam like this, it's partially because that way it's like, ow, that would have hurt. But it's also just to kind of help sell that this isn't a real person. Because you could easily just drop a person and that'd be the end of it, kind of landing, just slightly ahead of the camera. Because that's the gag, is that you do that, and then you have the, perfectly placed actress on the ground. So the camera kind of loses focus for a second as they fall ahead, and then it wipes down to that. I just did a video with Corridor Crew on their YouTube channel, and it should be coming out pretty soon, but that was something we talked about, was Blade. I had to do exactly one of these shots where he jumps out of a window and then lands on the ground. And the decisions made on set for this were really not good. The shot, I'm happy with the work I did on it, but the actual shot itself is terrible. Just because it's, he's jumping 10 feet onto a beanbag, basically, and then they digitally kind of warp him and then shift him into another take of him landing on the ground. So the whole thing's a really bad gag. But this is a CG character falling down, falls ahead of the camera, and then that wipes to a completely practical shot with a lot of CG mist everywhere. So I'm going to play the shot in segments, but just going to play through a little bit of this. The way that this was pulled off was that they had a big light rig exactly where, just to jump ahead a little bit, where this orb appears. So they actually had like a big LED rig there that, because originally when I was watching this, I'm just like, what was the approach? Like obviously CG clothes for a lot of this, but the one thing that caught me was just the lighting interactiveness on everything was a little too good to fake it and get it all to match. So, I was kind of intrigued to see how that was done, but it's actually a big LED 360 degree lighting rig that was able to create, you can program in all the flashes and everything else to get some interesting results. So actually in my office here, a lot of this stuff is, a lot of the lights I'm using are the digital Sputnik Voyager lights that they invented for Star Wars. So do all the lightsabers and program everything. So it's really cool. You can actually use your iPhone and run your finger on the lights, like take a photo and actually use your finger in real time to program the lights and create fire or lightning or whatever effects that you want and get that exact feedback. And you can actually sample colors from the environment as well. So there's a lot of different things you can do to really program the timing and everything to get the exact look that you want to work on set. They're also waterproof and battery operated, so you can throw them into the ocean and have them illuminate everything. It's really amazing what you can do with them, although they cost thousands of dollars and they're really heavy, which also is kind of annoying compared to like the Quasar Science lights and a few other ones that I've got going. But yeah, so again, just lightning going on here. Interesting thing is here, this is all CG. So, I'd be very upset if the VFX supervisor for the sequence was like, let's shoot it all practically and then match move digital clothing to line up with this. So it's a lot easier just to create entirely CG everything here, and that way you've got the background plate, but you can have I'd imagine the clotheslines, everything is entirely CG, just because it's it makes sense just to have complete control over it. But yeah, the clothing and everything, you would probably scan all these clothes, get the props and scan it all in, recreate all this stuff using all the textures that you can. And then you got this kind of solidifying and freezing. And that really comes down to just, first of all, making the sim really become dull in terms of being created more kind of rock solid, and then creating all the kind of frozen particle system on top of it. I think ILM did this stuff, I can't recall. But yeah, I mean, it works. So you can see it's all shiny, it's reflective, it's got bits of ice growing all over it. And then in the future shots, you see more of the stuff waving around. So again, it just makes sense rather than having a giant wind machine everywhere, just to go completely practical. What I do find interesting is that you do have some plants moving around a little bit in terms of stuff that's here. So maybe someone came in and like wobbled everything around a little bit, but considering the amount of wind and craziness here, the plants, the foliage doesn't really move at all throughout this whole thing. So I think that's kind of interesting. But again, more of the same stuff, just lightning, all this, and then you're doing these fragmented clothes, which is pretty straightforward. It's just a mesh that's rock solid, drops and breaks, and then you're doing a CG sim of the wire pegged on there, and then creating all the mist. So one thing I do like a lot about this is just, it feels like a meat freezer. So you've kind of populated mist everywhere. So you can see that there's a lot of this same particle stuff that we've seen before, just icicles grown everywhere. But on top of that, then you've got kind of like a horror movie. You've got all this mist blowing around everywhere, or floating everywhere, I should say. And it looks really cool. But on top of that, then you'll see, as the clothes come down, it disturbs everything. It also creates more. So you're seeing all this mist rolling out wherever these impact. So the whole thing just kind of looks really cool. So same thing as I mentioned before, just having this kind of outer layer. And the more I look at this, the more I think it is kind of very similar to how I explained it. Maybe it's more complicated than I explained it, but I feel like you've got the volume here, but then you've got kind of this 3D fluid sitting on top that's more kind of noise driven. So it's very texture driven in terms of where it emits. And then that's like phasing or has turbulence, so it's swirling around. So you got a lot of this stuff moving around, and perhaps there's refraction going over the top. I don't know, but you know, I feel like it probably doesn't need it. Just more of a 2D refraction rather than going all out 3D, because everything else is volumetric, so it just doesn't make sense. What is interesting is you've got these kind of bursts happening here, which is kind of cool. So I don't know, without looking more intensely, like, I guess there is a lot of that. There's these kind of pockets as if it's bubbling. Because I believe that was the brief that they had for this, was that it's meant to be like these kind of like bubbles going up to the surface, and then when they breach, they create this. So again, it's not hard to do something like that. It's more about creating random particle spawning effects that create these fluids that are swirling around as an additional pass on top of what I'd already described. Again, that's my perception of this, is kind of looking at it out of context, but you can see the turbulence kind of splitting everything apart, so it's definitely fluid driven. And the way you would do this is kind of like just simulating fire, but with in 0G. So in other words, no heat or buoyancy to it, no gravity, but just lots of turbulence, no expansion. And then you can see it kind of breaking up there as a fluid. So again, it's basically like simulating fire in that sense. And really quick, again, same deal. You got CG guy coming down, and then you're just matching to the live action. So I'd imagine he's, I'm sure he lands, but I feel like that's all CG until he's literally just sitting there. So maybe they did have him kind of jump and land, but I feel like you don't actually see any of that in camera. It's all just CG, the CG performance, and then transitioning after he's kind of stabilized on the ground into that. And I feel like this stuff's CG. It's kind of funny. Like, usually you would make the call for something like this just to say, okay, let's just do it all dry ice everywhere. But yeah, I feel like that's all CG. I could be wrong, but it looks like it. Yeah, that looks all CG there too for the mist. Again, usually at this point I would have imagined a lot of times you just go for practical effects just because you're gonna get interaction. It just sounds like the thing to do, but it sounds like here it's just like, no, let's just shoot all clean and then add it all in. So that's that sequence. But again, I just thought it'd be fun to kind of break this stuff down because there's so many subtleties in this, and I think that a lot of us don't pick up on it, and a lot of it really is quite interesting, and the attention to detail really works. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing looks really good. I'm really impressed with this, and again, it's such a throwaway sequence that you don't really put much thought into. It's like the arrival of the two Terminators, but it's also a very important sequence. It's also one that we've seen before, and every time it's almost been different. I kind of liked Terminator 1 and 2 just because using paint box, so it's like such a simpler thing to do, and it wasn't that special. In fact, what I thought was kind of interesting is a lot of the areas that were hot. So when we're talking about stuff like this, that was all just painted to be kind of more of trying to think of the right color here, but it's just having more of a hot color to it without actually having any glow or anything necessarily on it. But a lot of this was just 2D paint on the computer. And then Terminator 3, ILM did that. It was very refractive and very geometric in a lot of ways, as well as obviously, it was on Rodeo Drive. So, is it Rodeo Drive or yeah, it's Rodeo Drive. So like having, the shops and the mannequins all melting and everything else, it kind of screamed, we have computers now, let's go and get really advanced. It looked cool, but it just kind of steered away from the feel of it. And then from there, all the other ones kind of did the same thing of like pushing it more in that direction. So I like this just because it is a whole different spin on it, where it's more, I believe, meant to be this kind of like bubbling water, in a contained space feel. That's meant to be the feeling of it. Like a water balloon, I think, was the official reference for it. But to me, it feels more visceral than that. But I love the ice and the way it kind of affects the environment. I think that's the one thing, is that you're building up this anticipation, so that way, before it ever comes in, it isn't just a bit of lightning flashing around and paper blowing like the first two Terminators. It's actually interacting and affecting the environment. It's cooling it all down. And those are sorts of things I think just have worked really well for this. Okay, so this is the future kind of flashback. So this is an interesting shot, just kind of going through it all. This is entirely CG. So Blur Studio did this stuff, and I thought that was kind of interesting. I think it's a perfect call getting Blur to do this when that's kind of their forte. So Tim Miller's studio, Tim Miller, the director, his studio is Blur Studio, and they do a lot of game cinematics. So they're really amazing environments. Like, I think for me, I always feel like the environments are what really separates them from a lot of other places. So I think that this is right up their alley to kind of do shots like this. And so I like this because, again, it really kind of conveys this really desolate and wasted environment. But what's also interesting is having these ships flying through the environment here. You'll see it a lot more later on, but it isn't like, okay, we're having some dust here to help kind of interact with the environment and tie it all together. What instead's going on is it's more all the liquid and everything is being kicked up everywhere. So you're seeing these like vapor clouds being kicked up. But on top of that, you see like bits of the environment are being kicked around, and in some cases, buildings collapsing, walls and rocks falling apart, things like that. And this kind of shows like how menacing this thing is. It's navigating so low to the ground that it's actually destroying the environment, and that kind of shows a lot of what's going on isn't just destruction from fighting and explosions or whatever, but it's also just from, you know, everyone on such larger scales like maneuvering through all this. It's just kind of really wasted away the entire environment. So what I do find interesting in the shot though is that you know, you basically have your environments. This is a foreground element, that's a midground element. This would all be considered a background element. So what I find kind of interesting is having these obelisks, those pillars going through here. So I wish I could draw a straight line. So having these in here though, I think kind of helps with the depth cue, because a lot of this stuff is low to the ground. So what's going to happen is you got your foreground element, then you have your environment here, which is more mid to background. So that's all MG, BG, FG, and so the thing is, then you got the sky, and the sky is basically just a matte painting. It's an environment of the sky, just, you know, with clouds. So it's very easy for this to feel like, okay, there's your geo, and then there's the sky. So it's a subtle touch, but having these pillars here really helps interact or more tie everything together, because suddenly you've got these things going from midground all the way into the background, where it is fading off into the sky, okay, into the background. So it's subtle, but these things here help from making this entire 2D matte painting, which is basically, you know, a majority of this. It helps merge it all together, and it's a nice trick that just helps kind of connect everything together and bring it all into one. This is a shot that's in the trailer. You see the skull rolling down. Again, just some nice subtleties that are going on here is, you know, you don't have like one or two bones. Like everything kind of gets affected a little bit. And so having the other ones kind of disturbed a little bit, like that bone there sliding down, stuff like that. It's simple, but it's the difference between being awarded a shot, taking it on and saying, okay, I'll get the skull to roll down, or having dirt, pebbles being knocked around here. Little things like that that are so subtle, but you can see that there's actual rocks here that are falling with it. And those are the things that really kind of help with a lot of this, kind of help bring it all together. So subtlety like that really goes a long way, as well as obviously, you know, I love the water shader. It's very Fresnel, the angles. So you've got all this like muddy, murky water here. It's quite reflective in the background. All of this is just a really nice touch, but I like all this. This feels quite a lot like photogrammetry. I'm kind of curious to see what their approach is for doing stuff like this these days, but it's just the way it all kind of blends together so well. It feels real, like this is the sort of stuff that you get in nature, where it's not like there's all the rocks and they're sitting on other rocks. They're all kind of tied in the same mud and everything together. So I really like it. I think that they've done a really great job on this stuff, and it just works. It's very gritty, quite desaturated. The whole environment is, obviously it's meant to kind of foreshadow like what the future holds. You know, there's all of these are quite gray and desolate. So just to kind of go through the breakdown here, again, you've got these 3D pillars that are help blending all the environment together. All of this is CG. I really think just looking at how dense some of these wireframes are, so yeah, I'd say that a lot of these elements are photogrammetry. Just the fact that you've got other stuff here which is quite low res. I feel like these are all more like maybe just going the path of doing matte paintings over the top, so they're more projections. I could be wrong. I'm kind of curious about this. Just But you can see here the level of density that's going into some of these buildings. It makes me think that a lot of this is probably, a lot of this is, scanned, and then, or else it's just a crap ton of displacement on top. But looks really great. And then CG ship, CG characters. Just again, kind of showing the amount of detail that's gone into this. So I'm kind of curious about the shot now, just kind of looking at the wireframes and how kind of low detail a lot of this stuff is compared to what you're actually seeing as the end result. So again, like I haven't worked at Blur in like 6 years, something like that. And before that, it was 10 more years before that. So their pipeline hadn't drastically changed too much in that time. But I feel like in the last couple of years, it has quite drastically changed as they've moved more into film, and the tools have changed too. So assuming that they're more welcoming of having 2D teams, I'm kind of curious how much of this stuff might potentially be painted up rather than just the 3D texture. Just considering the lack of detail on this compared to a lot of the detail on this stuff here. Again, whether it's displacement or whether it's photogrammetry. So anyway, I can nerd out all day on that stuff, but at the end of the day, this stuff looks great. Like I love the attention to detail. I like the fact that you do have this muddy, dirty environment, but it is all kind of wet, and it also just kind of helps play around with the idea of like if everything's soaked, then having these ships flying around, you're able to kick up these sprits everywhere. You're able to really help tie the whole thing together. So there's the kind of 360 sky map or skybox I was talking about. But then actually, this is cool. I haven't seen this. So then you got your background element, your midground element, or in this case foreground. But that's all 3D. 3D is just rendered separately, so that way you've got more control in comp if you want to blur anything out, and just in general more control overall. And then the depth cue, just in the background there to help kind of make everything fade more into the background and give it more sense of scale. And then a fluid sim for the water. Cool. And this is just covering again more like doing a turntable, so it shows scale. So again, having a reference guy in here as something to kind of give emphasis to how big that is. And then CG environment, so you can see all the detail that's gone into this. So here's a shot, obviously on a soundstage, CG environment, so it's all whipping by. I would have thought they would add some strobes or something on here to help kind of feel like as if they're moving, but it seems like all the lighting's static, so that's interesting. And then the decals to help show some variation. So again, just showing more of these shots as they come together. So what was interesting is there's a couple of shots here I'll quickly go through. So this is just showing the environment, and like I said, it's kind of cool that you actually get to see a lot of this being destroyed, just kind of helping show the interaction and also the destruction that happens in the environment. But what I thought was interesting is these photogrammetry scans of cliffs and everything that then get utilized in the shot. So you got the shot here, it pans down, and a lot of that's actually scanned here. So I'm kind of curious, like one of my buddies, Brandon Reza, who used to work at Blur, doesn't as of like a week ago, he does a lot of rock climbing, like all the time, and he got really big into taking his DJI Mavic 2 up there and scanning all the environments, and he was showing me in his iPhone like these 3D models that look so real and so amazing. So I'm kind of curious as whether or not that's something that, while he was still a Blur, something he ended up doing, because you can see like you can get these really real scans and capture a lot of that environment that you can then bring in and build as a base to then detail out and add everything else on top. So as they come down, so that's all practical there, but then everything else is CG, and that's just tracked in. I'm assuming that's practical. That's actually one thing I will mention though, is like if this is CG, I'll take a closer look in a second, but one thing I do find that is always the giveaway is when people land a lot of the time, when you show that in 3D, it always looks wrong because it takes a lot to get that right, because it's the follow through. You land and then your whole body is trying to stabilize itself, and the muscles, everything being thrown forward. So it's very hard to pull that off, and it always feels either really stiff or really springy. It's very hard to kind of get the perfect kind of blend of both. So I think it's really smart in a way, whether it's on purpose or not, to have them jumping down and then cut to a close-up shot, in camera, which is obviously going to look real. But I do think that these guys are real in this shot anyway, but it's just more of a side note, because I always find that to be the thing that looks a bit odd. So you can see the mountains were a base, and then you're detailing it all out, adding everything on top. Yeah, so they are real. But yeah, like I said, it's one of those subtle things that goes a long way. But I like adding all the mist and all the other atmospherics on top. Just helps kind of tie it all together, because it's one of those things that without that, it all falls apart. Effects are one of those things that can be either be the center focus that people go ooh and ah about, but a lot of time effects are the thing that actually really sells the shot. It helps tie everything together, having all these additional elements in there. So one or two more I'm just going to quickly jump into. So I find this interesting. Again, practical set. Pretty much the entire thing is replaced. So you can see here that it's basically just gone all digital, and you just have like a horizon line here that's blending to the two. And then that's all digital fire everywhere. It looks great. Again, really like the stuff they do. And then there's some of the digital characters. That's all in camera. I like the touch of fire, things like that. It just helps where there's such like a big bland area that's like 30% of your screen. Adding something like that just kind of helps give it life without there needing to be anything there to distract you. Because you're going to see something like this, but if it was a character, you're actually going to end up looking at the character. But you're visually going to register fire or anything like this without needing to take your eye off of her, which is the main focus here. So again, it's just little things like that. Like I think that this is basically a giant game cinematic. The sequence here with a few shots of practical characters on cards, and the rest of it's all digital. So it makes sense to give it to a studio that is more competent in doing that sort of thing, as being their specialty. Rather than doing something that's like very intricate with live action characters and a lot of mixing and matching. So, I think this is a good choice, and obviously Tim is going to know the strengths and weaknesses of his studio. I think that this is a really cool sequence just to kind of see it all come together. Of course, the majority of it is all digital. Okay, just a couple more shots here from the sequence just to cover really quick. Again, this is one that's basically, I'd say 100% digital. So again, that skybox that we're looking at, there's all the mountains and all the detailed environments. It's still the same set as it has been. And then you have these digital characters. Really epic explosion. I imagine Dancy or someone like that did that shot, because there's some guys at Blur who do fantastic effects. I feel get underappreciated in that respect, because again, the effects are something that mightn't be digital characters and everything, but it still goes a long way to being the eye-catching thing that people look at. So, there's nothing to pick apart here. I really love, like, you can see a freeze frame, something like that. It definitely has, it looks digital, but it looks great. I love it. And there's another point to bring up too, is when you look at an element like this by itself, it's not always going to look, it's going to not connect and look believable in the environment until it's illuminating everything else. You can see here it is the light source that's affecting everything. And obviously once you introduce the environment, that's when it really looks good. I remember back in like 2009, 2008, I was working on a movie, and it was the first time I ever used global illumination with an explosion. And suddenly, because like fire is a light source, having the fire illuminating the environment changed everything. And that's how I've worked ever since, and it's become a pretty standard practice these days. But without that, the explosion is just not going to sit right in the scene. But this way, the intensity of the entire thing affects everything. When there's that second burst here, it's going to illuminate everything. So that's awesome. So I'll play through that one more time. And here's the finished shot. Then there's just like a lot of action, and you have one of these guys. I've forgotten the name of these, but I thought this shot's kind of interesting. It's not really that tricky to pull off. You basically have your 3D model, split it up, and out of that, like if I were to break this down, it's a few passes, at least how I would do it. You have your CG character, and then he's animated, doing his thing as one character. Then you have this other one that right now is invisible. Okay, so not there, but what you're doing is you're running this kind of ink pass that's spreading up over the body. So as it moves out, it looks like it's forming it, but all you're really doing is having another character and having particles or texture, I would assume particles, spreading out over the body to kind of formulate the entire character. So then over the next few frames, it would go from nothing to suddenly being a complete character. And so it looks like it's coming from nothing, but it's actually, like, especially the arm is a good example of this. Oops. The arm's a good example of this, where you can see it growing out over everything, and it's more just having the effects spreading out over the whole thing. And then finally, because you've got a 3D character and then one kind of just growing out of nothing, you have that additional layer here, which is tying the two together. So you have this kind of liquid particle pass that initially starts out as a few strands that are just kind of connecting the two together. And that way this feels like it's not coming out of nowhere, it's actually growing out from this character. So basically 3 different elements to build out the entire effect. But, looks cool, it's a quick effect, and that's the main thing, is that if this wasn't quick, then it would be an entirely different thing. But having these strings, even after he's like fully formed and running away, having them kind of follow through, it just makes it feel like it's still feeding off of the other one. And I guess it also helps give reason to have those tentacles. Okay, so I haven't actually seen any of this stuff yet. I had one of my team put together these clips, so it's kind of interesting getting to see this a little bit more closer up. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. It's exactly what we were just talking about. So if we were to look at something like this, it's basically, like I said, it's a 3D, like a particle system that's spreading out over the body, kind of formulating all of this stuff. So this would be kind of fun to do something like this, to maybe put something like this together. Again, if someone wants a tutorial, maybe leave a note in the comments, and I could put something like this together. But it's basically just having a particle system growing over the entire thing, and then having that separate system here which makes it feel like it's feeding off of each other as well. So yeah, you can see the whole particle system effect. And so this is one more clip. I think this is the last one. It is the last one. So this here, like I said, like before, it's pretty much an entirely digital environment. Foreground there is practical as this blends in. So there's the live action shot. There's the digital shot. Sorry, I'm kind of obsessing over these cars now a little bit. Okay. And there, so you can see smoke, and then you see the fire fading on, like, or I should say not the fire, but the illumination from the fire. So yeah, at this point that's not fire, that's just the lighting from the fire. And you can see down here the fire is then being blended on. And so all of them together is a perfect mix. So yeah, that's beautiful. Again, really great job. I love the fact that it is pretty much CG. You get complete control that way. Obviously rendering this stuff, like rendering big environments like this, pain in the butt, especially when there's like a lot of volumetrics at that scale and the level of detail with the displacement, motion blur on the displacement. I'd imagine some of this stuff is painful as hell to render. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you got a lot from it. If you want to leave a comment with any questions or anything like that, let me know in the comments below. At the same time, if there's a particular movie that you would like to see covered next, let me know. And if there's any effects that were covered in this video that you would like to see a tutorial specifically around, also just leave a comment and let me know. I'll make sure to reply, and I'll also do my best to put together some additional training and videos around that. Like I said, I'll be back with part 2 shortly. We'll cover a lot more of the big end sequence, the airplane battle, and a lot of the other visual effects in Terminator Dark Fate. On top of that, as I mentioned before about the training, I've got a new class that I just put together. It's now February 25th, I think, at the moment. So I just put it together right now. It's available for the next 3 weeks. So you can get it all free, all the scene files, the lessons, all 10 lessons. It's almost 15 hours of training, as well as the rotomats, the LiDAR, the HDRI, everything that you need to recreate the exact visual effects shot shown in the video. So you can get it all for free by going to liveactionvfx.com, or there's a link in the description. And again, I just want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check out the link in the description to get 2 months free access to their premium level membership, and you'll be able to enjoy all of the training on their platform. So that being said, I'll be back with another video soon. And if you could take a moment to subscribe to this channel, as well as share it, all that good stuff, I would be forever grateful. I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching. And make sure to check out that free training while it's available.